Today we'll deal with approach and landing. You will be shown the techniques necessary to safely land your aircraft under different conditions. You will also be made aware of the need to make appropriate decisions on the type of landing you should use. Before getting into technique, some general comments. The object of landing is to get back onto the ground at the lowest possible vertical speed and the lowest possible horizontal speed while maintaining adequate control of the aircraft. This will vary according to conditions. Approach and landing should be considered as a continuous process. By this time, you will have had enough flying experience to begin developing your body's sense of motion to assist you in landings. But your most important sense is vision. You must learn to estimate distance and depth. As well as being a matter of practice, you must learn how to view the ground clearly. Close objects become blurred at high speed. As you land, focus far ahead of the aircraft, as you do when you're driving a car traveling at the same speed. Then, as you slow down, you can focus much closer. If you focus too narrowly or closely, objects will be blurred, and the timing of your reactions will either be too quick or too slow. Another good habit to develop is keeping one hand on the throttle throughout the landing. Then, if you find you suddenly need power, you can react immediately. It is also a good idea to practice landings from full glides with the engine just idling. This helps you develop the judgment required for forced approach landings. In this tape, you'll be shown three types of landings: the normal landing, crosswind landings, and short, soft, and unprepared field landings. Normal landings seldom occur except under the most ideal conditions. In nearly every landing, there is some degree of crosswind. As well, it's very likely a soft field landing would have a crosswind component to it as well. A normal landing takes place against the wind. This slows the horizontal velocity of the aircraft. As you get closer to the ground, you make a slow transition from the normal glide attitude to the landing attitude. This is called the flare, or roundout, and is started about 15 to 30 feet above the ground. Once started, the flare should progress continuously until you are on the ground. If your speed is correct, you will begin to lose speed and settle as back pressure is applied to the control column. The backward movement of the control column should be such that the plane remains just above the ground until landing attitude is obtained. If you are flying a tailwheel plane, the main landing gear and the tail wheel should touch the ground simultaneously. In a nose wheel aircraft, make sure contact with the runway is made with the main landing gear and there is no weight on the nose wheel. Once you have started the landing process, do not push forward on the column to offset any backward movement of the controls. If too much back pressure had been used, it may be relaxed slightly or held constant depending upon the degree of error. Also, you may find the need to use more throttle if too much speed has been lost. When you are just 2 or 3 feet above the ground, put more back pressure on the elevator control. Because the aircraft is close to stalling speed, this action will not increase or maintain height. It will simply slow the settling phase, allowing you to touch the runway smoothly on the main wheels first. Remember, it is the attitude of the plane, not the movements of the control column, that determines the completion of the touchdown. Once on the ground, if you are flying a tailwheel aircraft, hold the control column as far back as possible until you come to a complete stop. This prevents the tail from bouncing and skipping. It also improves your directional control. In a nose wheel plane, let the nose wheel come down gently on its own as your speed decreases and the elevators lose effectiveness. Keep the aircraft straight and avoid excessive speed, since this tends to put too much stress on the nose wheel and causes wheelbarrowing. Once your instructor has completed the initial stage of your landing instruction, you will be required to plan the approach. As mentioned in an earlier tape, pre-landing checks are done on the downwind leg of the circuit. Visualize the circuit and where you're located in the traffic flow. Now, estimate where you will reduce your power and where you will turn final. Once on base, reduce power and airspeed to begin your descent. Make necessary drift correction to keep you on a ground track that is perpendicular to the runway. Fly base until you're able to turn final using a medium bank to bring you in line with the runway. This turn must be done at a safe altitude and will depend on terrain and any obstructions. It also must be done to give you a long enough final approach to allow for corrections in power and airspeed before touchdown. The last 500 feet of your approach should be straight without any slipping or turning. Control your height by using flaps. Since this will affect the trim of the aircraft, you will have to take appropriate action to control the rate of descent and airspeed. A well-executed approach inevitably results in a good landing. To visually maintain your approach, use the perspective method. When viewed from the pilot's seat, the runway appears wider at the approach end than the opposite end. If the approach angle is constant, the runway does not change shape. If you steepen your approach angle, the runway appears to get longer and narrower. Conversely, if the angle becomes more shallow, the runway looks like it is getting shorter and wider. As mentioned before, normal landings are rare. You generally have a crosswind component. This is any wind which affects an aircraft at an angle to its longitudinal axis. If a crosswind is not properly managed, it can cause a loss of control. When you land into the wind, you are able to maintain a straight heading with relative ease. But in a crosswind landing, the side of the aircraft is struck by the wind while it is in contact with the ground. And because of the plane's tendency to weathercock, it is forced off its heading. Prior to landing, the crosswind causes the aircraft to drift across the runway instead of holding true to the center line. If you don't take corrective action, the landing gear ends up bearing excess force. The same situation occurs if the path of the aircraft is held true to the center line with drift compensated for by crabbing and the wheels touching the ground, not aligned with the runway. Crosswind landings tend to be more difficult than crosswind takeoffs. This is because during landing you lose speed, which in turn reduces the effectiveness of the flight controls. There are two basic methods for landing in a crosswind. They are the side slip or wing down method and crabbing the aircraft to compensate for drift. The first method is the most popular and the easiest for beginning pilots. When using this method, avoid beginning the slip too soon on the final approach, unless, of course, there is another reason to slip. As you approach the runway and the drift becomes apparent, side slip into the wind to counteract the drift. Use the rudder to keep the longitudinal axis of the aircraft aligned with the center line of the runway. Once you have touched down, be sure to keep the aircraft in a straight line to avoid ground loop. The aileron control should be held toward the upward wing after touchdown to prevent it from rising out of control. When using the side slip method, make sure the upwind main wheel makes contact with the runway first. The second method of landing in a crosswind involves maintaining a heading or crabbing the aircraft into the wind so that its flight path is aligned with the runway. This means the longitudinal axis of the plane is not aligned with the runway just prior to touchdown. If alignment isn't achieved, there is a possibility of damage to the landing gear or difficulty in controlling the aircraft. Therefore, it is critical that at the precise moment the plane touches the runway, it is swung into line by the use of the rudder. If contact is made too soon, the aircraft will land with crab. If contact comes too late, you will land with drift. The third type of landing you will be shown in this tape is used when you encounter short, soft, and unprepared field landings. During the approach, you want to reduce airspeed as low as possible while still maintaining a maximum of control. Usually, you approach with the flaps extended. Check the aircraft manual for the recommended airspeed. Factor in the gust factor to the approach speed when appropriate. The need for a lower approach speed lessens when winds are strong. In gusty conditions, you should add an equal amount to half the gust factor in your approach speed. For example, if the wind gusts from 20 to 40, the gust factor is 20. That means you should add 10 to your normal approach speed to allow for gusts. Your altitude above the threshold will vary according to the height of obstructions in your approach path. Using power for this type of approach gives you a more accurate control of descent. It is important that the flare be judged accurately to avoid stalling or flying into the ground. Leave the power on until the flare is completed. Touchdown should be at the minimum controllable airspeed, and the pitch should be approximately that of a power-off stall. Nosewheel aircraft should be held in this position as long as the elevators remain effective. Tailwheel planes should be held in the three-point attitude during braking. Flaps should be retracted as per the recommendations of the aircraft manufacturer. In soft or unprepared fields, note the following. In nosewheel planes, hold the nosewheel clear of the surface as long as possible and use the brakes sparingly to prevent excessive loads on the nose gear. In tailwheel planes, the tailwheel should touch down with or just before the main wheels. Use the elevators to hold it down throughout the landing roll. The use of flaps will depend on conditions. Keep in mind that the flaps on low-wing aircraft may be damaged by mud, rocks, and slush thrown up by the wheels. Usually, braking is not required on soft surfaces and in fact may cause other problems. When landing over an obstacle, the techniques are generally the same as for a short field landing. What will vary is the steepness of the approach. To save flight time, you may decide to practice touch-and-go landings. In this procedure, the takeoff is executed while the aircraft is still in its landing roll. You will have to do the essential pre-takeoff cockpit checks while the plane is still moving on the runway. Before these checks are done, the aircraft must be under complete control when landed. Here are the essential pre-takeoff actions. Put the flaps up or set them for takeoff. Set the trim for takeoff. Make sure the carburetor heat is off. And use full power for takeoff. If you are operating out of a controlled airport, you will need clearance for a touch-and-go landing. There are several factors that affect the length of the landing run. Crosswinds will lengthen it due to the diminished headwind, and in cases of a 70 to 90 degree crosswind, you may have to land as if no wind condition exists. When encountering light or shifting winds, plan a landing run as you would under a no-wind condition. Occasionally, you may have no choice but to land with a tailwind. When landing under these conditions, retract the flaps and neutralize all flight controls as soon as possible after touchdown. Some runways have a slight gradient which can lengthen your landing run. In some cases, it might be advantageous to land uphill with a slight tailwind rather than deal with the effect of a downhill gradient. Bear in mind, the heavier your aircraft, the more runway you will need to land. This becomes especially important if you are landing on a short field with obstacles on the approach, a slippery surface, or under light wind. Grass surfaces, although providing plenty of resistance to the landing gear, can be deceiving. Wet grass or dew can reduce your braking capability by 30%, meaning the landing roll will be longer than on a wet paved surface. When landing on a wet runway, be aware of the danger of hydroplaning. This occurs when the tires of the landing gear are separated from the runway by a thin film of water. Hydroplaning can cause up to a 700% increase in stopping distance. If you suspect hydroplaning, Release the brakes immediately and then reapply with a slight pressure. Increase the pressure as the aircraft slows. Wheelbarrowing occurs on a nose wheel aircraft when the nose wheel is allowed to touch the runway first. In a crosswind, the aircraft may yaw rapidly about the nose, causing a loss of control. Other symptoms of wheelbarrowing include wheel skipping and an extreme reduction in braking effectiveness. To correct wheelbarrowing, close the throttle and relax the forward elevator pressure to the neutral position. This will lighten the load on the nose gear. Return steering and braking to normal. If control is regained and there is enough runway left, abort the landing and go around again. Ground loop is associated with tail wheel aircraft and is a violent, uncontrollable swing which occurs on landing or takeoff. It is caused by half a dozen different situations. It may result from touching down while crabbing into the wind, or touching down when the aircraft is drifting sideways. It can also be caused by a crosswind acting on the fuselage and rudder, weathercocking the plane into the wind. Allowing the upwind wing to rise combined with weathercocking can also produce the condition. Failing to control a wheel landing properly or incorrect recovery action for drift after a bounce are the other two causes. To prevent ground loop, take the following action immediately. Keep the control column fully back and apply opposite rudder. If this isn't enough, open the throttle to make the rudder more effective. And remember, never attempt to realign the aircraft with the runway until you have positive control. If you are starting to get into trouble while landing, go around again if there's enough runway to do so. Remember, air density will affect the length of your landing roll. The landing roll will be longer in warmer air and at higher altitudes. Combining both makes the landing run even longer. The final section of this tape deals with some irregularities you may run into when landing. If you should touch down too soon, there's a tendency for the aircraft to bounce into the air again. The action you take depends upon your airspeed. If it is high and the bounce is small, release some of the backward pressure on the control column and allow the aircraft to descend. When you are at the correct height, flare out into landing attitude. If the airspeed is low and the bounce is high, apply power to assist in the flare-out to prevent stalling. If the flare is premature, the aircraft may start to climb. Check the backward pressure on the control column and descend to the proper height. If the airspeed is too low, apply more power. Close the throttle before trying to regain the landing attitude, and then flare out into the landing attitude again. Also, keep in mind recovery for bounce or ballooning will mean you will have to reintroduce any necessary drift correction. The decision to overshoot a runway because of a poor approach or landing rests solely with the pilot. Once that decision is made, apply full power and accelerate to a safe climb speed in level flight. Reduce flap extension as required and raise the nose. Stay straight as you open the throttle and roughly trim off the pressure on the control column. Start climbing as soon as you have control of the aircraft. Raise the flaps, adjust climbing speed, and retrim. If a bad approach on landing is the cause of the overshoot and the remaining runway is clear of other aircraft, you may climb straight ahead. If visibility is a problem, move to the right of the center line. Fly parallel to the runway, and while climbing, keep a lookout for other traffic. When overshooting, if the carburetor heat is on during the approach to landing, it should be turned off as soon as possible after power is applied. You were told about the effect of wake turbulence on takeoffs in a previous video. It can also affect you if you are landing behind a large aircraft. When flying behind a large aircraft, remain above its flight path. If you are landing behind a large plane that has just taken off, touch down prior to the point where the large aircraft rotated. If the large aircraft has just landed, plan to land beyond the point where it touched down. Remember, if you believe it is safer to wait or use an alternate runway, ask the controller for a revised clearance. At controlled airports, you must receive clearance to land. Normally, it is given without being asked for. If you do not receive clearance, do not land. Unless there is an emergency, overshoot. After landing, quickly vacate the runway. Clearance to taxi after vacating the runway is the prerogative of the control tower. You will likely be cleared to ground control. If this service is not available, you will be told to taxi somewhere between the landing roll and the point where you stop to do the post-landing cockpit check. Now, take time for this quick review. During a crosswind landing in a light aircraft, why is the into-wind wing lowered? During a crosswind landing in a light aircraft, why is the into-wind wing lowered? Lowering the into-wind wing will stop drift. When there is a strong crosswind across a runway, why is it necessary to consult the crosswind's limitation chart before deciding whether to use the runway? When there is a strong crosswind across a runway, why is it necessary to consult the crosswind's limitation chart before deciding whether to use the runway? By checking the chart, you will be able to determine whether the amount of crosswind is within the limitations of the aircraft. More important is the limitation of your skill level as a pilot. When excessive forward elevator pressure is exerted during a touchdown in a nose-wheel aircraft, wheelbarrowing may result. How can this be prevented? When excessive forward elevator pressure is exerted during touchdown in a nose-wheel aircraft, wheelbarrowing may result. How can this be prevented? Wheelbarrowing is prevented by making sure the aircraft lands on the main wheels at the correct speed. During an approach over an obstacle into a short field, good airmanship requires that the power not be fully reduced until after the landing flare. Why is this? During an approach over an obstacle into a short field, good airmanship requires that the power not be fully reduced until after the landing flare. Why is this? This will alleviate unnecessary pitch changes close to the ground. Why is it essential to monitor airspeed during an obstacle approach? Why is it essential to monitor airspeed during an obstacle approach? Monitoring the airspeed ensures you have the correct approach speed. If you approach too slow, you may stall. If you approach too fast, you may cause the aircraft to float.